Right. Hello. Welcome, one and all, to my talk on open source software, games development, and careers. Lessons from my career as a rendering nerd. So, let's kick this off. Just as a fair warning, this talk will probably mention C++ and CMake at some point, as well as .NET related technologies. If that is a scary prospect, you may want to look away now. I appreciate C++ is terrifying for some people, but you have been warned. So, just to clarify who I am, my name is Matt Jones. I am a 2 times Microsoft MVP for developer technologies. I have been working at Sumo Digital for just under 2 years now. I've been about an MVP for about the same length of time. So for context, if you don't know who Sumo Digital are, they are a massive AAA studio, mostly based in the UK. They do have studios in India and in Canada as well. Games they have worked on would be things like Hitman, Forza, Sonic, and a bunch of others that I can't list here because I haven't really worked on them, and I'd be here all day. But yes, that is who I work for. So speaking of being a rendering engineer, what technologies have I worked with? So I've worked with most of the common backends at some point or another. So OpenGL, Vulkan, and DirectX 12. And during my career, I have also done a lot of work inside of Unity and also Unreal in the AAA space. Other stuff I've done outside of that, I am the owner and leader of the C# community Discord, which is hosting this lovely event that we've got going on over the next few days. I'm also the lead maintainer of an open source cross-platform 2D game engine called NovelRT. It's written in modern C++, uses CMake. I'll be talking a tad about that later. I've also done a lot of charity events and special game jams, especially for Autism Acceptance Month this year, and as a way to educate people who may not have had education for the games industry previously, and to also help raise money for charity. I've also done quite a few university and college guest lectures here in the UK. I have another one planned for January 2023. I'm not sure if that will be broadcasted or not, but just something to keep tabs on if you find me interesting today. So I'm just going to quickly run over what this talk is about. So as you can probably guess from this list here, this talk isn't going to have a lot of code in it, mostly because that's not the focal point of the talk. While it is a technical talk, it's not going to have lots of C++ or anything like that. This is mostly focused on open source software and how it affects employability, how it's affected my career, and how I'm hoping it'll help, how my life lessons will help you get a job in the industry. Yeah, so the employability section will mostly be focusing on boring stuff, I guess I could say. So CVs, portfolios. It's important, but probably not the most exciting thing in the world. But I do feel I need to talk about it because I've seen a lot of interesting submissions in my time. There's also this disconnect about open source software I would like to fix as well. So there's going to be a whole section on that. And yeah, my own personal sort of experiences with it and how it's affected my life and career. So moving on to the first bit, we'll begin talking about the employability stuff. I want to, first of all, dispel some myths and outline some truths and alternate approaches for getting into the industry. So as you can see here, you don't need a degree to get into the industry. This is something that I think has been perpetuated for a long time. That's just not true, especially in 2022. The games industry is really evolving in that it's embracing apprenticeship culture a lot more. So for those of you who don't know what apprenticeship culture is, I think in the US you guys might call it like internships. It's not exactly the same thing because apprenticeships here in the UK can turn into fully fledged jobs. One such example of an apprenticeship scheme would be the Sumo Digital Academy. So how that works is if you're looking to make a career switch or you're trying to get hands-on in the games industry, the academy is there to help you basically have an apprenticeship position. Apprenticeships generally don't pay loads, but you are getting paid for learning as opposed to paying academia for a bit of paper that you may or may not believe in. That said, the one thing I will say about degrees, they do make your life easier in terms of getting past human resources, because human resources don't understand your lovely portfolio of games and technology. So it's good for visibility to have one, but it's absolutely not required if you can get, if you can be perceived by the right people, basically. So aside from these 2 points, things that will really help you get a job in this industry. A good portfolio is super crucial, even if you have a degree. A good portfolio is basically mandatory, just because of the way education tends to work. I'll explain more in detail later, but the portfolio is basically a representation of you and what you want to do. Game jams. So game jams are, for those of you who don't know what they are effectively like hackathons, but for video games. If you've ever heard of Ludum Dare or the Global Game Jam, those are 2 really big ones. What they will do is provide you with a certain amount of time to effectively make a game based on a theme or an idea. The reason game jams are important is because, they teach you a lot about scope and other things, but I'll be talking about that a little later. The last point here is networking. So by networking, I don't mean the stuff where computers talk to each other over the internet. I mean talking to actual people in the industry, like myself. The industry talks a lot, so being seen, again, by the right people is very, very important for getting yourself out there and getting seen. So let's talk about my experience for getting a job at a AAA studio. So first thing I found was that I made my portfolio fit the kind of positions I was applying to. So for context, again, I am a rendering engineer, so a lot of my portfolio was based around rendering, DirectX, Vulkan, OpenGL, across many different platforms. For my final year dissertation, because I did end up actually going to get a degree in the end, but it was kind of a sort of a final gambit more than anything. What I actually ended up doing was I shaped my final year dissertation for basically rendering stuff. I did a lot of work on mobile devices and GPUs within them. Showing off that kind of research and finishing it, I think, is pretty good. But yes, to bring a more sort of relatable example, if you want to be something like a gameplay programmer, you need to show that you can write gameplay code. It's no good rolling up for a gameplay programmer position and having literally no gameplay code to show, right? Or no gameplay code to talk about. It's incredibly important that your portfolio is kind of geared towards the role in the industry you're actually after or that you desire. Your portfolio does not need to be flashy, but it does need to be clear. I'm sure many of you could make a much better job of it than I did in my time, but I quite literally use GitHub as my portfolio. I just pinned the repositories that mattered to me, such as my game engines, my render pipelines. I wrote a little bio about myself. Just having it be clear and straightforward is good. Flashy can actually harm user experience if it's too much as well. But I'll be talking about accessibility in a little bit, but just keep that in mind. Game jams for portfolio work should be finished and functional. Now, I know this is kind of a little bit contradictory might be the right word, in terms of what game jams actually are, in that game jams are for getting an idea and creating a game based on that idea in a very, very short amount of time. I think Ludum Dare's average jam is about 72 hours. But getting them finished and even polished, if you can, like within that time frame, shows a really good understanding of the development lifecycle of games and knowing when to cut features and to actually work on polishing what you already have. Networking. So as I said previously, networking is very important because the industry likes to talk. If there is any networking events you can feasibly attend, you absolutely should, especially if there's any big names going to these events. Simply because, again, you want to be able to get your work and your passion for the industry in front of these people. You want to be able to show them who you are and what you do. GDC is a great example of this. I appreciate GDC is probably the most expensive event you could go to, though. So don't worry if you can't explicitly make it to GDC. There's many other great events. I mean, one here in London was EGX a little while back, although it's a bit more casual, but there are usually a few studios at places like EGX that are looking to maybe hire fresh talent into the industry. I actually met the Rebellion developers at EGX. So for context, Rebellion are the studio who work on the Sniper Elite games. So just being able to talk to these people and see what they want and see if you'd be a good fit, etc. It's a really good experience overall. Even if you don't end up working for them, having those connections just makes you more visible. So this is sort of probably the most boring slide out of the lot. The most common skills in the AAA space, C++ and C# are quite possibly the most used languages in the space. The reason for this is kind of twofold. C++ is kind of the main driver for a lot of the game's development ecosystem as it currently stands. It's where most of the core tech goes. Vulkan is written in C. DirectX, I believe, is C++. All this stuff that games rely on is generally all native and ahead of time compiled. C# is also used a lot. For gameplay code specifically, it's used mostly in things like Unity and Stride. But I'll, again, be talking more about the usages of C# later because it's kind of a subject unto itself. The next most common language, I guess, would be either HLSL or GLSL, depending on where you end up. For context, this is a high-level shader language and graphics level shader language, I think, respectively. High-level shader language is the most popular one out of the two, I believe, mostly because it's the language that DirectX uses for its shaders primarily. You can use HLSL with other tools nowadays, like Vulkan, thanks to the fact that DXC can support compiling HLSL to SPIR-V, which is super cool and super nice because it means I don't have to write GLSL anymore. But if you're going into rendering or visual effects, knowing a bit of HLSL will help you a lot. And unsurprisingly, Unreal Engine is kind of a really big one. Now, I know a lot of people sort of have this conception or idea that the games space, especially in AAA, tends to run in-house engines a lot. That used to be true quite a few years ago, but Unreal Engine has kind of been slowly creeping in for a couple of factors. The first one being that the community and ecosystem around it, it's just there, it works. And also the feature set of Unreal Engine by itself. There's a lot of stuff it provides, such as Sequencer, that just kind of works out of the box. And if it doesn't work out of the box, it's also a source available engine, and AAA teams usually have the resources to modify things like Unreal Engine internals like that. Which is why it's kind of become more popular than in-house engines, because in-house engines generally require even more resources than that, effectively. So that's why people have been moving away from it and towards Unreal Engine, which is both a good and a bad thing, depending on how you look at it. But yes, if you learn Unreal Engine, you're very much going to be wanted in the space. So just sort of run down what employees like to see. Quality over quantity. This is kind of going back to what I was saying earlier about game jam entries. You want stuff that's finished in your portfolio, and you want it up front. Because stuff that is finished proves that you can actually stick it out through a project. Games development is incredibly complicated, and it's very easy to get started, I would say, but it's not very easy to actually finish. So being able to actually finish this stuff proves that you actually have the capability to work on something long term. So having that just sort of visible in your portfolio is really important. Make your work as accessible as possible. So there's multiple ways this could be taken. The big one for me, though, I think, is just, again, it's kind of going back to making your portfolio too flashy, right? You want stuff that's kind of upfront and to the point and not too difficult to navigate, because you don't know who's going to be looking at it. Effectively speaking, there's also other forms of accessibility, things like color scheme of your website, or how screen readers interpret your content. Just sort of going on to the next point here, putting your best work in front of your potential employer first, kind of going back to the accessibility point here as well. Employers are busy people, especially AAA employers. So if your best work is not very easily accessible as the first thing they see, especially as a first impression, it's not good. So you really want to have it so that your best work is in the front, and it's very clearly visible, and employers don't have to work to get to it effectively. Your best work should be a representation of you, which kind of leads into my next point here. Make sure you enjoy what you are working on. I cannot stress this enough. If you do not enjoy the games or the tools or the whatever you're making, if you don't enjoy what you're working on, it's going to come through in the interview. Like, it's kind of tough being in interviews and having to talk about this stuff in depth if you don't enjoy it. So being in interviews, from my experience personally, from interviewing in lots of places, lots of studios, being honest about what you want, what your skills are, what you're after, what you enjoy working on, super, super, super important. Because it's especially long term as well, because if you end up in this position and it's doing stuff it's doing work that's in your portfolio, but you don't actually like the work that's in your portfolio, that can be incredibly draining and actually cause burnout. So you're going to be doing this for like 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. So yeah, really make sure you enjoy what you're doing. So advice and rules for CVs and portfolios I've kind of pulled out of all this sort of experience. First rule being, if you fear any of your work misrepresents you, rip it out. Even if there's a shred of doubt there, get rid of it. Quality over quantity, as I said. Your best pieces should be up front, and they should, it should all be your best stuff effectively. Because anything that's like, maybe out of date, or just doesn't reflect your interests anymore, or you have like problems with like how people might view it, get rid of it. It's not worth it. It's not worth the hassle. Which leads on to my next point. Only leave the best stuff in. One great piece is honestly better than 10 unfinished ones. When I applied to work at Sumo Digital, my own, I have a few portfolio pieces, but my main one, which was far superior than the others, and I kind of wish I'd only shown off this one now, is my game engine NovelRT, which has had years of work put into it, years of learning. I'll be talking about that later. Again, to reinforce the accessibility point, make sure it is easy and clear to navigate. Again, you can just use GitHub for this stuff if you want. Obviously, if you're doing a lot of visual work, that might be a bit tougher, but yeah, GitHub is a great place to start building a portfolio, because you can just pin repositories, you can have it all set up nicely, and just go for it. Again, you could probably have a look at mine if you really want as an example, but I think you could probably do better than I did, to be honest, on this front, because I mostly just wrote like a big block of text and then pinned some repositories. And then somehow I got employed after a very long journey and adventure. So yeah. As I said, employers will judge you based on the work they get presented with first. First impressions matter. Make sure it counts. Make sure it's good. Now, this next point is kind of a bit contentious. Student work is fine, but it might not always truly represent you. So if you've already been to university or college, and you've had to, I think we've all had this story, you've been in a group project, you're the only one pulling your weight, there's lots of constraints and restrictions on the project in question. And so, you finish the work, but sort of begrudgingly more than anything else. That's not really what you're about, right? So student work is fine if you feel it represents you and you can actually like show it that way. But if you don't feel it does, get rid of it. Replace it with something better, because I assure you, if you're doing game jams, if you're working on open source stuff, you have something better to show. The other perspective as well for studios on this front, and this is something I know a lot of people don't really like to hear, is student work is very hard for us to assess, because we don't know what's actually what your co-workers are doing. Co-workers? Other students that are working on the same project as you. I'll get it right. But yeah, so it's very much just it can be a bit of a mess to untangle, and employers don't have that kind of time, realistically. So you definitely want to have your portfolio be about you. And then this last point is kind of more optional, but if you can have work that you can present, that also along with a bit of learning that you got from it, basically. So I wrote this software to learn the basics of Vulkan pipelines, for example, if you're wanting to be a rendering engineer, or I learned how to implement rope swinging game mechanics in Unity by doing this project. Basically showing and growing your problem skills and your progression. It's kind of optional. You don't have to do this. I know I didn't do it, but again, that's because my portfolio was kind of not super great. This is kind of lessons I've taken from that since then, being on the other side of the fence. If you can, definitely outline what you've learned from each piece. So, speaking of portfolio pieces, free open source software and why it matters and how it can help you. So just a quick rundown for those of you who don't know what free open source software is. It's basically software that's open for all. Anyone can use it, mutate it, distribute it, and development is usually community driven. So actually a very good example of open source software is something like .NET. For the most part, I think everything except the debugger in .NET is open source these days. Obviously, I might be wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure that's how it is. So if you ever wanted to work on your favorite tooling and language, you actually absolutely can do so by going to the .NET organization and seeing what repositories they have available there. Why it matters? Relevant XKCD, but effectively it is the foundation of basically every bit of games tech that you can possibly imagine. SDL, I think, is kind of the prime example of this. Sorry, I've just realized I need a drink. 1 second. Yeah, SDL is kind of the prime example of this. Its whole purpose is to, just for context, SDL is basically to handle things like input, windowing, basic audio, a bunch of other stuff, but do it cross-platform. This is to save a lot of work so you don't have to interact with platform-specific APIs so often. So, for example, on Windows, when you want a window in native land, you have to use Win32. SDL hides all that from you, so you don't have to worry about it so much. So SDL is written in C, sort of as a side effect of this, because C just kind of works in the most places, as much as it's kind of sad to think about that C works in more places than C#, but that's just kind of the truth. At least at the moment. I'm hoping it'll change. OpenAL is kind of in a similar boat. So for context, OpenAL is an open source audio solution. It kind of works similarly to OpenGL in terms of how its functions are structured and stuff. Again, it's implemented in C. OpenAL is mostly used on Linux-based platforms. So Linux, obviously. I believe it might also be used on like PlayStation and a few other places. So it's very big. It's a small component, but it is quite, it adds to something big. It's a foundational component. Vulkan is a very interesting bit of open source tech. So I believe the SDK itself is open source, but also the specification is kind of open for anyone to implement in their own graphics drivers. Now, I'm not saying you go and implement your own graphics driver, but it is an interesting use case because Vulkan, again, it works in more places than DirectX. It works on Nintendo Switch as well, actually. So yeah, Vulkan is very good if you want cross-platform support in 2022. It was also kind of implemented to solve a previous problem of OpenGL being the only cross-platform solution. OpenGL being written in the 90s and kind of implemented in the way the specification was sort of designed, it was for a different era. So Vulkan's kind of, I guess, just like take two of OpenGL, but without a lot of the issues that OpenGL sort of had just by intended design, unfortunately. Unreal Engine uses all of the above internally. It uses SDL basically on all platforms. It uses OpenAL on non-Windows platforms. Same for Vulkan. Because on Windows and Xbox, I believe Unreal does use DirectX 12. But yes, open source stuff drives some of the biggest gaming pieces of technology around. So a .NET example of games tech that's open source, Monogame is actually fairly a popular one. It's an open source replacement to XNA. So for context, for those of you who don't know what XNA is a very old kind of SDK/.NET based framework for making games from like 2006, 9, around there. I've never used it. I don't actually know. It has very nice Visual Studio integration, and it's also fully open source. So anyone can pull it down from NuGet, just use it, and can make a game with it. It has actually been used in some very popular games, such as Streets of Rage 4, which is kind of a sort of pricey game on. It's a 2D fighter on Steam, but it's sort of one of their more well-known titles. Looks very, very flashy. If you like flashy fighting games, Streets of Rage 4 is a good option to check out, both from just like a visually appealing and like a technological standpoint. Very interesting stuff. It is also the backend for other .NET projects, such as the Flat Red Ball engine. So Flat Red Ball is another 2D engine alternative in the .NET space. A lot of this .NET stuff is kind of not as popular as the stuff I was talking about previously, but it's good to know that the space is growing and to be aware that some of these technologies in the future might actually become very relevant. I think a very good relevant example of that is actually Godot with the mono build. I think in Godot 4 they're doing something to stop it being a separate build. I don't know. But it's, yeah, .NET is growing. The presence is there. So the question some people are probably asking is, how does this factor into my portfolio? So as an engineer, working on or with open source technologies gives you a very strong variety of portfolio work. If you have the time to expand your portfolio, having a variety of things that but also pushing in the direction you want, I think is a very healthy way to approach things. It shows you're flexible, it shows you're adaptable. You're also giving back to the technologies that you care about, or the technologies that support technology you care about. So if you care about Unreal and you work on SDL, indirectly one day your change might end up in Unreal Engine. Open source is actually a very big driving factor in games. Even though the games industry doesn't always want to admit it, that is kind of just how it is. Also for personal development, it does help with your problem-solving skills, because again, it forces you to adapt quite a lot of the time. Especially in such a chaotic space as games, because games are chaotic, and pretending they're not is just lying to yourself. So being able to solve such complex issues in a variety of environments will just enrich your learning process and sort of your understanding of programming in general and transferable skills a bunch. But I think a big one here as well, a big point, is teamwork and communication, especially technical communication. By working with maintainers or being a maintainer yourself, you are going to have to, interact with other developers and work with them to get the changes you want in, or changes you want submitted to be merged in, I guess, depending on the perspective you look at it. This is actually incredibly important, especially in games where studios tend to be quite tight-knit. Getting along with your coworkers is actually quite important. So it's so from that perspective of just being a decent person, this will also hopefully grow empathy and inclusivity skills. So yes, I called it a skill. The main reason I'm calling it a skill is because, to be frank, right, as humans, we're not all the same. But you should generally be putting people first over code. There are many people who haven't had maybe the same opportunities as you've had to learn things, or may not understand things the same way you do. Maybe have come from a disadvantaged or minority background that just hasn't had the opportunity or the chance, for whatever reason. Being understanding and patient with people, especially in open source, I think will make for a more healthier and more enriched community in the long run. especially where games is concerned, because I mean, I work at a very progressive studio, so it's nice to be surrounded by lots of people who sort of understand this stuff, but and sort of will listen to me, especially on matters of neurodiversity and other things, like LGBT. Just having, being sort of patient and understanding and just working with people. Like, it's a collaborative environment. You gotta be kind. And just showing that off really makes you just a much more employable person. Because honestly, this is something actually a lot of associates say inside the C# Discord. We can teach you how to program. We can't teach you how to interact with other people, or work in a team. So those skills have to be homegrown. So absolutely try and keep that in mind and put those skills on display in your portfolio if you can. So just some other examples of open source in games. Clang Sharp is kind of a big one. It's a big one mostly because Clang Sharp, for context, is a C# bindings generator. So what it does is you give it C headers and it will spit out C# code for you that can call into the C APIs. This is incredibly important for the games industry because a lot of our ecosystem is based in C and C++. That's just how it is for a multitude of reasons, which I'll explain later. So as a result, Clang Sharp serves as a really nice bridge for sort of helping the gap there. I believe it's now a .NET Foundation project, so if you want to go and have a look at it, you absolutely can. TerraFX, which is kind of like a multimedia framework. It's maintained by Tanner as well as Clang Sharp. Tanner being the lovely human being who worked on generic maths for .NET 7. He does amazing work on Clang Sharp and TerraFX. I highly recommend you check it out. I think TerraFX only works with DirectX 12 and Xaudio 2 at the moment, like in stable. But don't take my word for it. You should probably ask them, not me. But yes, it's there. It exists. The .NET story for games is growing all the time. And as I said previously, the mono build of Godot also exists. So the core of Godot is C and C++. But you can use the .NET ecosystem with it by using the mono version of the engine. So that's a lot of tools, basically, is sort of what I'm getting at. .NET's main use in games is tools. That's kind of its main focus. The main reason being is because the tools don't need to live on consoles or iPhones or anywhere else. So .NET has a very great story on desktop. It has a fantastic story on desktop. So as a result, all these examples mostly are just tools. So UBT is kind of a really big one. For context, UBT is the Unreal build tool. It is a custom build tool for Unreal Engine that is all written with .NET and is driven by C#. You define modules in C#. You define what modules depend on other modules in C#. It's a very interesting system. I believe it also supports the Unreal header tool internally for generating the reflection metadata that Unreal uses. It's really, really interesting to see how it all works. So yeah, that's kind of the main use case I'm mostly exposed to these days. Obviously, there's Unity, which uses it for gameplay scripting. For however long. It's using it for things like the scriptable render pipelines as well, and a bunch of other really cool things. Stride is all written in .NET, so it's more of an outlier because it's a whole engine. But yeah, Stride is purely written in .NET. It's very much just it's just a .NET engine that's open source. It was formerly known as Zenko. So again, if you want to check it out, you can. Another interesting use case that people don't realize is that C# is actually used to write shader compilers as well. So the Monogame Effects compiler, or MGFXC for short, produces DirectX shader files that Monogame can consume. Very cool piece of tech. Again, absolutely go and check it out if you can. Then obviously there's my own technology, NovelRT. So NovelRT is at its core a C++ tool, but yeah. It's using C# for a lot of the tooling outside of it. I'll explain more in a bit later. There's also many other lovely tools that are in the AAA space that .NET it powers that I can't talk about because they're confidential. Really sorry. But you get in the industry, you'll find out about them, won't you? So, speaking of NovelRT, I will have sort of just talk about it for a little while. We've got about 10 minutes left of this talk, so I'm hoping I can squeeze it all in. This is the last section, so please bear with. So, yes. As I said previously, NovelRT is in C++, where I use .NET here. C++ is just cumbersome for things like SDKs. Like, I'm sorry, you don't want to be doing that. You really don't. There's no point. There's no advantage. As I said, C# just works on desktop platforms. It's incredibly powerful, especially with the optimizations made in .NET 7. And we also plan to include C# support for the future of the engine itself anyway. So writing the SDK in C# as well isn't really that far of a stretch. The generic math APIs will probably make some operations faster, I'm hoping, mostly around things like matrices and vectors, because that's all part of the sort of semi-similar space. They're sort of up in the air right now, but that's kind of my hope. That's my goal. And yeah, idiomatic C# is just very nice to work with. I mean, I've been writing C# for about a decade now. It's, even after all this time, even though C++ is kind of the main bread and butter of my job at the moment, I will always love C#. It's kind of my first love in programming, and I always want to support it for this stuff. And yeah, as I said, modern.NET is also portable. So in the beginning of NovelRT, sort of a life story time now. I had no idea what I was doing, but I did know I wanted to work in engines and rendering and tooling a lot more. So I spent a lot of time on it, and this is kind of how I began working as a rendering engineer. This is another good point about open source software, is that it gives you a chance to explore. This is kind of my takeaway from this point, right? It gives you a chance to explore different games technologies and figure out what you really want to do in this field. There's just so much variety out there. I mean, there's the OSU framework, there's Monogame, there's what I work on, NovelRT, there's TerraFX, ClangSharp, all this really cool stuff that's in .NET. Being able to explore it all as well, I just think is fantastic. So the other good thing as well, this is kind of why I drew from open source this idea of being able to communicate with other people and learning new things from others collaboratively. Over the time I've worked on NovelRT for the past few years, I've met so many wonderful people that have helped me out with this project, that have brought expertise that I could, only dream of, especially around things that I just don't understand, like CMake. For the longest time, CMake has kind of just been this magic box to me. I understand it a lot more nowadays, but yeah, it's very daunting to get into CMake. So being able to work with people that can sort of cover for your weaknesses there has been absolutely lovely. .NET expertise, Tanner, basically. Tanner's just been fantastic and just sort of guiding how the NovelRT C# support will look. And he's also been very helpful on the engine core and sort of helping me out when I get stuck on certain things inside the engine core as well. QA and unit testing, there's a lovely maintainer who actually works in QA full-time. He's been very good at helping maintain our CI systems and helping automate our unit tests so that the engine is borderline bulletproof. It's, again, fantastic experience. I think everyone on this journey has grown a lot, especially for the QA guy, because he actually manages our audio support now in the engine as well. So it's been a very collaborative process of growth, and just it's been fantastic. So I will briefly talk about NovelRT. I will make it brief because I've just seen I've only got like 6 minutes left, so I have sort of overrun slightly. But what I'll do now is I will kill this off in the hopes that I don't, and hope I don't mess it up entirely. And where's, there it is. So screen. So if I present the, okay, so I'm just going to quickly go over this. I promise I'll make it as quick as I can, because I am aware of the time. So, a working, organized open source project. So as I've said previously, NovelRT is a cross-platform, flexible 2D game engine with a lot of visual novel tooling on the top. It is aimed at designers and developers, or rather that's the end goal. We still have a lot of stuff to implement. We're still trying to get the basics right. I say basics, there's a lot of code in here. But yeah, so this is so let's talk about this from a maintainer and contributor perspective. Maintaining a good open source project, I think a lot of you have probably already heard this bit of the talk 100 times before, but for those of you who have never maintained or contributed to open source before, we're just going to quickly go over the bits that kind of matter, basically, the sort of the rundown of what makes a good organized open source project. So the README is kind of the very first thing any contributor will see. It should be very clearly laid out, very to the point. It should have build instructions that people can just pick up and go. Make it very, very clear. You can even throw your license in here for the software if you want. We've also thrown our contribution guide in here in our case, and also thrown in the fact that we have a code of conduct. We have an email that you can contact us by if things are wrong as well. Big blue button at the top as well for reaching us on our Discord, should you wish to help out or just learn how to use the engine. So since I mentioned the contributors guide, let's go there next. The contributors guide is basically just how do I contribute to the engine. It's kind of a rundown. Well, I say rundown. It's a detailed rundown, I guess, of sort of everything that's our process for accepting new features and accepting bug reports and all the rest of it. You can see here we don't have to read all this, but this is just like a good organized example. So sort of you can see here as well that we also have a section for first code contributions. Most organized open source projects should have something like this. So as a contributor for a first time, looking for how the process is and looking for good first issues is normally the best way to go. Not every project has this, obviously. It's going to vary from project to project, but in the case of NovelRT, I'd like to think we're fairly organized. So you can see here the label system we have. You can filter issues based on labels. It just makes things really easy to navigate, especially when you've got so much stuff going on, especially in an organized open source project such as like React or Stride or Godot or anything else, or Monogame. NovelRT is a bit smaller, so we obviously have less issues, but the point kind of still stands. As a maintainer, you generally want to be organizing your stuff with labels, just because it's nice, it's simple, it's clear, it's concise. People can click on the labels and just see everything under that category. So we'll also look at another feature that I think gets overlooked kind of too often as well, the wiki. So every repository in GitHub can support something known as a wiki. We use ours explicitly for contributors, as we do provide separate documentation for end users that's generated by Doxygen and a bunch of really cool stuff, but that's not the point of this talk, so I'm not going to go into that. But yeah, so for contributors specifically, we have a bunch of stuff here that goes into, it's not finished because we sort of started later than we would have liked, but we have a bunch of stuff here that sort of shows you how to do certain things. For example, adding dependencies in CMake can be kind of a pain. So we have a whole section on how we manage our native dependencies inside C and C++ with CMake. There'll be many pages like this in the future. If you're managing your own open source project, running a wiki is definitely something you can consider, especially when there's a lot of context-sensitive stuff in there. You definitely want to note it all down, especially for yourself, not even for just contributors, right? Like you're going to forget something at some point. So I think having it all organized in a nice way anyone can see, it's just best for everyone. It also shows you're really good at documentation, which is actually indirectly really good for portfolio work as well. So that's something to keep in mind. Just a quick drink here. Been going quite a while. So the last bit of documentation we'll quickly look at before looking at a sample pull request is the license. So why licenses are important. Basically, if you don't have a license in your open source project as a maintainer, it's assumed it's reference source only. The Unity editor is reference source only for what it's worth. So I don't know if they have an actual license in there, but generally speaking, if there is no license, you're not allowed to use it in any capacity. It's reference only, I would guess. This is what we call source available. But in the case of NovelRT, we are actually open source. We have the MIT license. You can do whatever you want with it. Just, make sure to thank us, please. It's a lot of work. Thank you in advance. So yeah, here is basically how you would specify the requirements of your, the rights you wish to hand over to end users. And I've just seen the time, so I really need to speed this up. So an example pull request. I think this is sort of the biggest indicator of how healthy an open source project is. Communication between people. Like you can see here, this person's opened a pull request. I went through and reviewed it, gave feedback. It's also it's encouraging feedback, which I think is the important thing. You want to be to the point, but you also want to be kind. Again, like you don't know how skilled someone is; they might have just missed something unintentionally. Remember, they're doing work for you as a maintainer. Be nice to them, and vice versa as a contributor. Maintainers have to sometimes look at a lot of PRs. Be nice to them. Just general human kindness goes a long way. So now I've got whizzed through that. I'll go back to the presentation here. I'm almost at the end, I promise. So back to this. So what are the life lessons I've learned from working on NovelRT? Open source creates some of the best engineers I've ever worked with. I've also had the pleasure of working with some of the best engineers already, without them needing to grow any skills there. But there was definitely a lot of collaborative growth, which is kind of like the main thing for me. And as I said, it can be an amazing platform for inclusivity and progression for all. I've kind of already explained why, and I'm out of time, so I won't go over it again. As I kept saying throughout this talk, the game industry talks. Be nice to each other. We see you. And yes, the most important thing, learn cooperatively, not competitively. I think that's sort of like the last takeaway from this. It's just, cooperation is the biggest thing in the games industry. There's just this job is already really hard enough as it is, especially with how certain gamers like to perceive the products we put out. So supporting each other, I think, and encouraging each other is just such a big part of the job. Cool. If you found me interesting today, all my socials are on the screen. You can follow me on those places. You can come ask me about NovelRT on any of them. Yeah, so any questions while I'm still here? Oops, did not mean to press that. It's gone right to the beginning. That's still fine. Okay. Any questions? So, let me see here. Any recommendations on how many other questions? There's Stride. Where's Q&A? Right, it'll happen in a few minutes. Make sure it goes. Okay, so what question am I answering first? There's a lot here. Huh. Okay, sorry, give me a sec. I'm just reorientating myself. Here we go. Okay, mono game or pie game? Mono game. Flat out mono game. Out of mono game or pie game, just because Python is used in the games industry, but it is not used nearly as much as .NET is. You want to have .NET in your portfolio for sure, because Pygame is a good middleware. It backs the RenPy game engine, if any of you have ever heard of that. So yeah, it's very important to have .NET in your portfolio, especially for the AAA space. Wow, this is a lot of questions. Any recommendations on how to tailor a portfolio if you're interested in multiple areas of game dev or unsure which you want to enter? Okay, so this is actually a good question. Generally speaking, the portfolio kind of evolves with you. So if you want to do this, that's fine. Being a generalist is a very valid thing. There are jobs that sort of support being a generalist. They're more like gameplay programmer positions, though. So what you probably want to be doing is you want to be showing that you're adaptable to fixing things in multiple areas. Yeah, so it's basically, my advice there is go for gameplay programming at first, and then just explore from there, because gameplay programming opens you up to a lot of things anyway. So that'll allow you to sort of pick and choose and explore and figure out what really interests you in the industry. Can I answer this monogame or FNA? I have no idea how FNA works, to be honest. I just know it exists. Monogame is a lot more popular. So my advice for getting into games is you want to pick the more popular tech from an employer's standpoint. So absolutely, a monogame for sure, just from that perspective. And from a technological perspective, I couldn't tell you because I'm not too in depth of the knowledge of either. Question from YouTube: rough estimate for how many hours has been sunk into NovelRT development? Oh God. How many hours are there in a year? If you take that value and multiply it by like, I don't know, the 3.5. I don't know. I'm picking numbers out of thin air. A lot is basically the answer. A lot. So I wish I could give you a more sort of detailed answer, but unfortunately, I lost track a long time ago. Any advice on how to start a games project? Okay, so starting a games project. This is going to highly depend on what you actually want to do. NovelRT kind of came about because I wanted to get more into rendering and tooling. So my first sort of advice is to ask yourself the question of what sort of thing are you actually wanting to work on? Are you actually wanting to work on a game or a game engine or some kind of game tech middleware like SDL? Basically, it's one of those things where it's just like you have to kind of answer it yourself in a way. Because basically, you have to figure out exactly what it is you want to do, research how to do it, set it all up on GitHub, and all the rest of it. So it's a bit tough to give like concise sort of input on that. Because again, NovelRT came about because I personally, growing up, just really got into rendering and engines, and just that tooling and stuff really interests me, basically. Okay. Question: is there actually jobs for tool developers to build tools and technologies for teams? Yes, I'm on one. I'm a rendering engineer. It's literally what I do. I literally kick the proverbial door down, implement tools, and then leave without elaborating. It's literally my job. So it is very much a viable job. Sumo are actually very much looking for people like that right now, especially in my studio specifically. So yes, absolutely, it exists. So, do you think it's valuable to create games from scratch using C# without Unity? Yes, it is absolutely valuable. Don't discount like technologies that aren't Unity, basically, in this regard. Unity is not that popular in the AAA space. .NET is mostly used for tooling and stuff, so being able to demonstrate you're able to make custom tools and then use those custom tools in a way that helps you make a game from scratch, like that is really impressive. Absolutely, if you think you can do it, then absolutely do it. Okay, next question: is it more beneficial to focus on a specific aspect of creating a game or general knowledge if you want to be hired? That depends. If you're wanting to go into gameplay programming, you only need to really be a generalist, as I kind of said earlier. Like you can be a generalist here, it's fine. It depends on the role you want. AAA is such a huge space. It's massive. If there's a role that you can think of that's realistically like available, it probably exists. So absolutely yes. It depends just on what you want to do. Yeah, I hope that answers your question. If it doesn't, feel free to rephrase it and I'll try again. Okay, what markets are there for technical artists apart from AAA? Okay, that's a good question, actually. So outside of AAA, there is obviously AA. Technical artists available in AA. I believe they're also valuable in indie spaces as well. It's very much technical artists are kind of liquid gold because they can do kind of both things, right? Maybe not to the degree of someone who's dedicated themselves to specifically one, but being able to do both at a somewhat lesser level is actually very valuable in a lot of cases. So it's flexible in terms of like, you could be in AAA, indie, AA, like it exists. Basically. Okay, so let's see. Scroll down here. Would you rather have unlimited budget but no time, or all the time but no budget? I think I'm already in one of these boats with NovelRT, because out of the several years we've been developing it, we've only received like a couple £100. So I think I'm already kind of in this boat to a degree. So I can kind of tell you now that from a mental health perspective, having unlimited time is really good, but it's also a curse having no budget, because it means everything's really slow. It doesn't put food on the table. But I do value my mental health, which is, again, why it's kind of my side gig and why I'm primarily work at Sumo, just so I can actually, like, eat. It is a fun job, don't get me wrong, but I also do need to get paid and, like, eat food. How difficult is it to design a game for modding? I think that's going to depend on the game and the tools you're using and the platforms you're on, especially. So for context, this kind of goes back to what I was saying about C++ being very important for games. C++ just runs in more spaces, like straight up. There's like a ban on jitting in multiple places. So you can't jit on Switch, you can't jit on iOS, PlayStation, I think a few other places. So it can be difficult from the perspective of you effectively having to end up making two versions of the same game so that one version is moddable, whereas the other one isn't. Though it depends what you mean by modding as well. So it's a complex question. If it's just like 3D models, you could easily probably just load one in. So you might not even need any code changes for that. But if it's actual like game binaries, that's a lot more complicated. So it depends, I'm afraid, is the best answer you're going to get out of me. What would you recommend for a first game project? Would it depend on whether the goal is to learn or to make the game a reality? So for a first game project, I would recommend, I mean, for a first game project, you're like, okay, so harsh truth time, your first game is going to suck. It just is. It's going to suck. Because it's kind of like art in that your first painting is just not going to be as good as your 50th. It's the exact same here. Mostly because there's a lot more elements that go into it than just English, than just the actual programming of it. Because if you're making a game, there's also the design, there's the art, there's the audio, there's the user experience you have to work on. If your story has a narrative, it's a lot of what ifs and a lot of questions there. For me personally, I mean, for my first project was awful. I remember I was in university. My first game was awful. I think I've hidden the repository on GitHub now because the code was such an abomination. It was like 36 hours into a programming session. I had lost all semblance of sanity. So my sort of my perspective there is just whatever you do, regardless, keep it as small as you can. Keep it small so you can finish it. You want the dopamine hit of actually finishing something. What do you think? How much What do you think? How much contributed to C? What? So, oh, I see. Sorry, I've misread it. My eyes. What do you think? How much contributed C# contributed to game modding? So C#, it plays a big role in the modding scene. I'm pretty sure. So like a lot of Unity games get modded often using things like Melon Loader and like injecting .NET code into Unity games. There's also like Harmony and like a few other like mono.cecil things you can be doing. There's also Space Engineers. Space Engineers is a very interesting situation, actually. The VRage engine is purely based on like some old version of .NET framework. But it has code for like dynamically loading other .NET DLLs to treat them as game mods. It's really fascinating and really weird. But when I think of game modding, C# is definitely the thing that comes to mind the most, just because it's really easy to do. So I'd say a lot is the answer. Like a lot of scripting languages generally tend to lead towards more moddable games. So another good example would be the Homeworld franchise. The Homeworld 2 proprietary engine consumes a custom version of Lua. So you can just write this custom Lua and it will load it and it will just work. It's a very terrible custom version of Lua, but you can do it. Cool. So what open source software would you recommend for a 2D mobile app game, or would there be a proprietary option that's better suited for that? Open source wise, I believe Monogame can do it. Keyword being believe. NovelRT is also aiming to do it in the future, but it can't right now. You're always welcome to come and help out. So that's definitely on the cards. It's definitely like in terms of open source, like those are the two options that come to mind. One that actually exists and one that's planned to exist. RenPy, I believe, can do open mobile 2D stuff as well, but RenPy is specifically for visual novels. So it depends. Cool. I hope that answers your question. The only thing I would say is that Unity has been working on mobile for a very long time. That is the only thing I would say. Okay, next question. Does microservice architectures used in game development and yes. So this is actually a very interesting point. They are kind of used. It depends where in the stack you are and how big your game is. Basically, I'm in the rendering side, so I don't actually know too much about this. I basically live on the graphics card, unfortunately, so I wish I could give you a more in-depth answer than this, but I do know for a fact that a lot of games use things like Azure and microservices for the backends for like authentication and other such things. For gameplay, generally, it's like clusters and like server instancing for actually like working out, like for like high performance gameplay. So there are benefits, but also it's important to remember that microservices can add overhead, so you don't want to be using them for absolutely everything, I think is what this boils down to. I wish I could give you a more in-depth answer, but again, I am a rendering engineer. I'm really sorry. I hope that sort of satisfies you anyway. Okay, where would you place Godot in comparison to other engines? So Godot it's in a very interesting spot. I think it's coming up nicely. It's definitely and it's in an interesting spot insofar as there's a lot of like different language bindings for it. Though mostly a lot of the time it's mostly just like GD script type stuff that people sort of end up using in the end for one reason or another. So ultimately, it's in a good spot, but I don't know if it's in a good spot for .NET specifically right now, I think is what I'd say. There was actually a C# Godot game jam that I saw on my Mastodon instance a little while ago. So it is there. It's just I just don't know how much it's there, so to speak. I know in terms of getting a job, the industry standards are still really important to have. Unreal Engine, especially if you're going into AAA. So that's just something to consider. Okay. Next question. Is data-oriented design a must for games development, or can object-oriented programming work just fine? So I'm going to be honest. I don't really like writing games in object-oriented styles. You can do it if the game is not too complicated. But yes, I generally prefer data-oriented design just from like a data composition point of view, as well as a just a flexibility of the API point of view. I think object-oriented programming can be a bit too what's the word? Just not. It can be clunky at times. Is basically what it boils down to. Next question. Are you actually expecting me to answer this one? Okay. I'm not sure I really want to answer that because I'm not a legal person. So for context, the question is to do with the terms of service versus modding inside dev communities when, for example, Grand Theft Auto can't agree on what's legal or not. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to answer this, unfortunately, because I don't know. I'm just a poor little rendering engineer. So I'm sorry. I wish I could give you a better answer, but I can't. Okay, DirectX Vulkan or OpenGL? Now this is the spicy one. This is one that I think people generally don't like to hear the answer to, because of complexity reasons. But generally speaking, it depends, right? If you know what you're doing, then absolutely DirectX and Vulkan are your best options, because OpenGL is slower than anything else available right now by far. But if you're just getting into graphics programming, those two things are probably going to blow your head off. So it depends on what your goal is. If you're trying to learn graphics programming, OpenGL is more than fine for 99% of cases. If you're looking to get the most out of a bit of hardware, DirectX or Vulkan are your best options, depending on if you need cross-platform or not. Basically, out of DirectX and Vulkan on Windows specifically, I would have to go with DirectX just because it can make assumptions and it's built directly into Windows, which means that there is like that hint of just performance improvements that you can get out of it from being directly integrated that way. Can I run a Vulkan game on my Apple Silicon? Yes, you can, as long as it's been compiled for the M1 and Molten VK has been correctly configured. You can actually run it, yes. NovelRT, it's an unsupported scenario right now, but NovelRT does actually have this kind of working for the most part. Like, we work on Intel Macs, so in theory, as long as you compile it for the M1, it should just work TM, basically. Do you think the new direct storage technology will change a lot of things for future games? It depends. I mean, it will certainly help. It will certainly help because, I mean, it's the way direct storage works is it's aimed to make, IO faster, effectively. So it will have effect on games that are directly built around Windows and possibly Xbox, I think. But outside of that, it's not going to make a difference because it's a DirectX specific technology. I hope that answers your question. I think it'll definitely be interesting to see how it affects things in the Windows space. My opinion on future of Unity, particularly in terms of integrating it with latest .NET. Now, this is quite interesting because I haven't actually worked with Unity commercially for a couple of years now. I'm basically, my personal opinion is I'm hoping for the best, is what it boils down to, because right now Unity has a lot of unfinished things. I don't know how migrating to modern .NET is going to affect any of them. It's not scheduled for a long time. I'm sort of just sort of, sitting back and waiting to see what happens. Like, I've got my eye on it. I am apprehensive, I think is the correct word here. I do see one more question on YouTube, actually, so I'm just going to put this in the chat myself. So the question here is, can documentation work have a place on a portfolio? It's not the most exciting work, but I feel like it shows you're willing to do some of the lesser fun jobs and knowledge about what you document. Yes, absolutely it does. As I said during my talk, contributing to open source software is super important. Being able to show that you can finish something is really important as well. And that means doing the not so fun stuff. That means fixing the really, really horrible bugs. That means writing hundreds and hundreds of lines of documentation. Showing you can do that stuff, yes, 100%. Absolutely show it off if you can. Yeah, I think what I would say, though, is try and work it in to something you care about, right? Like, in my case, I like rendering and tooling. So what I would do is I would work the documentation stuff in as part of that. Yeah, so we are most definitely running out of time now. I've run over by quite a bit, but yeah. Any more questions while I'm still here? Can I have a job? Ask my boss. Ask my boss. That is my answer to that question. Ask my boss. I mean, my studio branch is looking for people who are into low-level tooling and engine internals and other things like that. So, unironically, if you're in the UK and you want a job, talk to my boss. I need the referral money. Did you know I did a great talk? Oh, thank you very much. I absolutely appreciate it. Any other actual questions though? Or are we good here? Because I think I am holding up the next speaker at this point. So if there's any other really pressing questions, now is the time to ask them. But I do have to go in like the next few seconds, I'd imagine. You're very welcome for the presentation. Again, if you want to keep track of what I'm doing, all my socials are on the screen. I do really need to disappear so the next guy can set up, though. The next talk will be from Zach, who I'm very excited for. Does a lot of games development stuff in .NET Console, which I think is going to be super interesting. Oh, thank you. All these thank yous are really nice to read. Thank you. I really appreciate it. Honestly. Wow. Okay. Right. Well, before I get too mushy, are there any actual questions left? Because I think I do actually have to go before Brainiac literally drags me out by the hair. Okay, he's actually dragging me out. Okay, right. Well, in that case, thank you very much for coming to my talk. I hope you've enjoyed it. And yes, please enjoy the rest of Solution 1. I will leave you to the rest of your talks now. Goodbye.